The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world.
The Monetary Authority of Singapore and the People's Bank of China have renewed the bilateral currency swap arrangement.
Saudi Arabia is in discussions with China to price some of its oil sales in yuan.
But as ties with Washington continue to be strained, Beijing and Moscow are diversifying.
The Swiss system, that actually became weaponized by the U.S.
China and Russia have taken another step closer towards dumping the dollar.
This next moment, I think, sets the stage for everything that's going to happen in this country moving forward. I view some of the things I'm about to tell you as the most significant events, not only in my career, but ultimately in all of our lives. And I want people who are watching this to ask themselves, why? Why do I not know about this? Because they are very, very significant.
So could you explain why the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, so crucial to the future of the world?
I think it is incredibly crucial. It is a coalition of what amounts to pretty darn close to 90% of human population that is coalescing under a common theme, and that is, I think, to undermine the dominance of the West and the Western hegemony, and to do it properly with commodity backing. But if you don't mind, I'll take you down a pathway and let yourself and your listeners decide for themselves. I really noticed things starting to change in 2017. You know, out of nowhere, the German Bundesbank made a very big deal about repatriating their gold in 2017. Now, this was at the tail end of what had amounted to a 6-year bear market in precious metals. And, you know, in 2017 in particular, it was a rough year to own a precious metals company. You had Bitcoin really taking off. You had the equity markets doing fantastic, and gold was languishing. And central banks were selling it. It didn't make any sense to me. Why would the central banks be selling gold? I guess, well, maybe because it's been in the midst of a downdraft, and there's this new thing called Bitcoin that's really starting to take off. And maybe we were just moving away from the old way of doing things, and we're moving into a new reality. And well, the capitulation came to mind. And in 2017, 6 out of every 10 orders that we did were people selling. Most of them aggravated that Bitcoin, which was supposedly cut from the same cloth as gold, was accentuating itself. And why wasn't gold? So out of nowhere, the German Bundesbank, who had attempted to start repatriating their gold a year or two earlier from the Federal Reserve in New York, finally made a big deal about it publicly. And they said, hey, send us back all of our gold. Now, it's important to understand that really, since the end of World War II, the United States held most of the world's gold. And the reason, in a nutshell, that we did was that at the end of World War II, at Bretton Woods, when the dollar was anointed the world reserve currency, we made a promise to the world saying, hey, you can give us your gold because it's safe over here. You've gone through 2 world wars and it's safe over here. And I'll tell you what, we'll pay you $35 an ounce for your gold. And in turn, you take the proceeds of that and you buy our U.S. treasuries. And this will give you a return on a non-interest bearing asset, and it will be held safely, and we will always sell it back to you for $35 an ounce. Now, it had been that way for a very long time. And as I get down this pathway, we'll get to that moment where that all changed. So Germany says to the West, give us back our gold. And within a few weeks of that happening, the Bank of Austria, the Bank of Hungary, the Bank of Turkey, the Czech National Bank, the Dutch National Bank, all of these banks followed suit, said the same thing. Give us back our gold. And they said it not only to the New York Fed, but also to the Bank of England. We want to repatriate our gold. And this is really strange at this moment, because here we are in the midst of a downdraft in gold that is now going on 5-6 years, and the central banks are repatriating their gold. And now my interest is piqued in the speeches that I'm giving, like at the Sprott conference. I would cite that, hey, something's going on here. The central banks are increasing their gold holdings quietly and repatriating them even when gold isn't doing much. In 2018, the following year, you guys, gold was those same groups that repatriated their gold bought more gold as a group than they did in the 60 years combined previously. So now something's really going on. These banks are repatriating their gold from the Fed and the Bank of England, and now they're buying copious amounts of it. Really interesting. In 2019, those numbers were up nearly 100% in terms of central bank purchases. It's really ramping up. Central banks not only have repatriated their gold, but now they're really buying it. And, it's still, this is perplexing until mile marker number one. Now, before I tell you mile marker number one, I'd like people watching this to ask themselves, how much of this do I really know? And ask yourselves, is the media that is supposedly telling us the truth really telling us what is important? Because I view some of the things I'm about to tell you as the most significant events, not only in my career, but ultimately in all of our lives. And for the sake of those who haven't, we'll start talking about these substantial, significant events that should really have been noticed by the public, but haven't. And I want people who are watching this to ask themselves, why? Why do I not know about this? Because they are very, very significant. Mile marker number one, 2019, after the banks have just massively accumulated for the past 2.5 years and repatriated all of their gold, you have to wonder, were they clued into what I'm about to tell you? The Bank of International Settlements, which is the central banker's central bank in Basel, Switzerland, in April of 2019, quietly reclassified gold as the world's only other tier one reserve asset. Now, since 1944, at the end of the war, there had only been one tier one asset recognized by the central banks, and that was US dollars and treasuries. It's a riskless asset. And now, out of nowhere, they levy gold from tier three, where only 50% was valued on the balance sheet, to tier one, where it's as good as cash or equal to cash. Very, very quietly. And it makes you wonder, were the other central banks clued in by the BIS that, hey, get your gold home and start accumulating it? I happen to believe the answer is yes to that question. So in 2020, we start to see some more things that I'm connecting the dots to, one of which is mile marker number two. Now, mile marker number two, again, ask yourselves, people, have you heard of this? And if not, ask yourselves, why? Am I watching the wrong stuff? Am I reading the wrong stuff? And I would answer, yes, you probably are if you haven't heard about this. Now, this, what I'm about to tell you about, started a few years before, but really started to gain steam in 2020. And I look at this as maybe the most significant event in most of our lives to this point. And that is the foundation of the Chinese Belt Road Rail Initiative. Most people I talk to have not a clue what that is. And it's incredibly impactful and incredibly significant on the West and the West's future, because what it is the most ambitious infrastructure project ever attempted in human history. It is connecting Asia and Africa, parts of Europe, and even parts of South America, the old Silk Road plus, through maritime channels, bridges, railways, roads, and this infrastructure program will only be patrolled by military and commerce. It is the Panama Canal on steroids. But what people need to understand is just this particular little infrastructure represents over 75% of human population and 45% of GDP before global GDP, even before it's industrialized. The contracts and the settlement on the new Belt Road is predominantly being settled in the new Chinese digital yuan. This is a very, very, very big deal because for the last 3 years, the digital yuan has successfully transacted upwards ends of $20 billion in trades and in settlements, even using it at the Winter Olympics. And I would like to call this a beta test. We'll get back to that as we progress. But really big deal where 75% of human population is beginning to be indoctrinated into a new currency, into a new settlement system. This ambitious infrastructure project is void of American participation and void of dollar settlement almost exclusively and entirely.
This is like Marco Polo and the Silk Road. I mean, this is how significant this is what Marco Polo, I guess he traveled from Italy all the way to China, and then he started connecting the dots. Well, the Belt and Road, or this project that the Chinese are undertaking using their CBDC, central bank digital currency, and asset-backed digital, is going to make 75% of the world population switch to Chinese.
That's right. And wait till I get to what's happened with it here when I get to 2022. It's more significant. You'll see when we get to 2022, it's becoming right in your face obvious if you are looking. So you're right, and this is a big deal. And this is the beginning of the infrastructure, the external and internal infrastructure that is, I think, laying a foundation for massive de-dollarization. But we'll get there in a moment. Further things start to happen in 2020 that really start to make me say, hey, I'm on to something here, no question about it. Now, out of nowhere, the International Monetary Fund, well, this is a group of nearly 200 countries that was established at Bretton Woods, says to the world, hey, we want a new Bretton Woods. Well, what does that mean? That means that 200 countries from around the world want a new standard that isn't what the original Bretton Woods standard is, which is the US dollar is the world reserve currency. It said right on their website, we're requesting a new Bretton Woods moment, whatever the heck that means. But that really started to make me think, geez, this is bigger than even I had thought. When you have 200 countries from around the world on top of the Belt Road Initiative, on top of gold being reclassified Tier 1, on top of all the central banks repatriating their gold, now the IMF wants a new standard. So now I'm convinced something's going on. And then it gets even a little bit deeper than that. Now, of course, in 2020, the central banks are still massively accumulating gold. I mean, copiously accumulating it, especially Russia and China and India and the members of the BRICS. The RICS and BRICS are the big ones, Russia, China, India, South Africa. But they're continuing to buy it. But then we see something on the COMEX market, the commodity exchange here in the United States, that came out of nowhere. And without getting too deep, let's just say that every week the COMEX market, the commodity exchange, publishes a report. And that report is called the Commitment of Traders report. And the Commitment of Traders report that I have been following my whole career shows the positioning, long or short, of the largest traders on the exchange. And typically, it's only been commercial banks, speculators, which are the hedge funds. And if one goes long, the other goes short, and vice versa. It's a zero-sum game, so to speak, where the managed money speculating hedge funds will go long, the commercial banks will go short, and vice versa. And that's all that was ever on the Commitment of Traders report until 2020. Out of nowhere, there is a new list of reportables on the Commitment of Traders called the Others. What the heck are the Others? They're family offices and sovereign wealth funds. I would call them the most informed, well-funded private traders on the planet. And most of the trading these folks would do on the COMEX was done on something called the Globex, which is, it gives them a little bit more privacy and anonymity. So no one really knows who the heck they are. But what they did in 2020 was now following part and parcel with what the central banks were doing. They were taking metal off of the exchanges. Now, it's turned into a casino for sure. But what happened in 2020 was this group, the Others, started to drain the market, the COMEX market, of physical supply. When no one ever took possession, they took off in 1 year in 2020 more silver than we've seen in a typical decade being removed, and more gold that year than the Bank of Japan has in its official holdings. So now you have the most private, the most well-funded, well-informed private investors doing the exact same thing that the commercial banks and the central banks have been doing, and that is massively accumulating metal and taking possession of it. So here we are in 2020, and all of a sudden now, you see all of these things that are happening. The IMF asking for a new system, gold being reclassified Tier 1, the central banks repatriating their gold. All of these things are happening. The banks copiously buying gold, and nobody knows about any of it. 2021 comes around and we see Russia and Turkey and India and Poland and China and Kazakhstan and Hungary and Thailand and Japan and Brazil and the Czech Republic and Turkey. They're all buying gold. No one's talking about it. Why? Because of its riskless elevated tier 1 status. So anyways, 2021 comes around, and now I'm going to go back to what we talked about with the dollar being the world reserve currency. So the dollar was backed by gold as far as governments were concerned. We promise that any of the gold that we're holding for you, you can exchange your dollars, or even just the dollars that you own. You can exchange them for gold at a fixed rate of $35 whenever you want. So now we're going to get something a little closer to you, Robert, and that was towards the end of the Vietnam War. President de Gaulle from France realized that we were issuing more dollars in treasuries to fund the war than we had gold backing these promises. So he sent warships filled with dollars to New York Harbor and said to, President Nixon, we want our gold back for these dollars. And we gave it to him, and he bled down a very large portion of the gold held at the U.S. Treasury. And at that moment, Nixon said, okay, August of 1971, that's it. The window's closed temporarily, although it's never opened back up, so it's been a long temporary. But we went back on our promise to the world. And it was at that moment that the dollar was backed by nothing. And so the question that I ask the people out there, and it's amazing how few people know the answer to this question, is what has made the dollar the world reserve currency ever since? And you get a myriad of answers, usually centered around our military, or we have the biggest and most robust economy, or whatever. And I guess you could argue some of that is true. But what has made the dollar the world reserve currency was that 3 years later, Henry Kissinger was dispatched to Saudi Arabia. And he made a promise to the Saudis. He said, how about this? We will back you. Well, let's call it a joint military cooperation agreement. And we will stand behind you. We'll provide you munitions and support. No one will ever mess with the Saudi kingdom. But for that, OPEC is going to value dollar or oil in dollars globally. Okay, they said, fine. And so since 1974, every single country on the planet has had to own, virtually every country has had to own dollars in order to buy oil. And it has created this synthetic demand for the dollar called the petrodollar and made the dollar the world reserve currency. If you want to power your country, you must own dollars. It is the protection of the Saudi kingdom, and by default, the relationship with OPEC that has enabled the dollar to be the world reserve since 1974, because 3 years prior, the link to gold was severed. The dollar was at that point fiat, backed by nothing. And obviously, we all know the history. Since that point, the dollar's lost over 90% of its value. But that's for a discussion for a different day. And then comes mile marker number 3. And I would say this marker is way more significant probably than the 2 preceding. And the fact that our media doesn't say anything about it, I find it to be deplorable. And, I guess when you realize that every newspaper, radio station, television station, magazine in the United States is owned by 4 companies, there is no fair and balance. There is no, we're being fed the wrong information, because this next moment, I think, sets the stage for everything that's going to happen in this country moving forward. And that is what happened the day that we left Afghanistan. We are the American dream. I love this country. But I will tell you that as an American patriot, I was embarrassed to almost call myself an American the day we left Afghanistan. Leaving behind enemy lines, something we never would have done in the country I grew up in. You would never leave servicemen and women behind enemy lines. You would never leave the people who trusted you with their lives, the freedom fighters, behind enemy lines and give their biometrics to the Taliban. And I think there is no coincidence to the announcement of this mile marker number 3, because we embarrassed ourselves on a massive scale with people hanging from a transport plane as the last plane out of Afghanistan is going, knowing we have Americans that are still there today. It's inexcusable, and it's deplorable. And I think it in many ways changed the way the world looks at the United States, or at least our leadership, shall we say. And there's no coincidence to the timing of this massive announcement. Now, once again, what makes the dollar world reserve? Oh yeah, it's the protection of the Saudi kingdom. What happened the day after we left Afghanistan? Russia and Saudi Arabia announced a joint military cooperation agreement. What? You kidding me? What? Russia is now protecting Saudi Arabia? And the day after that, guess who did it again? Nigeria makes the same announcement that Nigeria and Russia are now Russia is protecting Nigeria through a joint military cooperation agreement. They're maybe the 5th or 6th largest OPEC producing country, and we know what Saudi Arabia is. Subsequently, we've already seen that Nigeria is selling their oil to China right now for yuan-denominated bond that is immediately convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. It's called the Petro-Yuan bond. And because it is immediately convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, this is how countries like Iran sidestep our sanctions. They'll sell their oil to the Chinese in the Petro-Yuan bond, and they can immediately convert it to gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange into kilo bars and take possession of it. This is why the Shanghai Gold Exchange has delivered close to 100 times more gold than we have, the COMEX, which sets the price, because these countries are doing just that. And guess who else is doing it? Saudi Arabia. So you have the linchpin of the dollar hegemony, the Saudis, and now Nigeria, 2 of the 13 OPEC member countries, selling their oil already to China, both being protected by Russia. Nigeria, part of the Belt Road Initiative, being protected by China. They're selling their oil in something other than dollars. This is a huge deal. Of course, we're not talking about it, but it is a massive deal. And as we go through where we are now in 2022, I'm going to try to put the pieces together and let you make up your minds for yourself. A lot of these pieces, I think, have been in play for a very long time, evidently. And even when you talk about some of the things that you saw in the past, you can add them to a progression of events where, they take a long time to play out. But I do think as we see what's happening here in 2022, it is speeding up. So let's look and see what's happened as the toilet paper roll is spinning now. What's happened so far in 2022? It'll blow you away. First of all, you have the Russian-Iran-India corridor that just came out. This is linking northwest Russia to the Persian Gulf via the Caspian Sea and Iran. Everyone else has to go all the way around, but the countries who are in the group get to cut through, right? You have Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia announce that they are contemplating joining the BRICS nations. Now, if you say publicly you're contemplating, it's a done deal. These countries are moving away from the Western alliances, and they are joining the BRICS. And Saudi Arabia. Did I mention Saudi Arabia? Yes, Saudi Arabia is joining the BRICS nations. You had Turkey come out and say they want to ditch the dollar for payments in Russian energy. And they've purchased 75 tons more gold in the first 7 months of the year than any central bank on the planet. They are the largest accumulators of gold. Turkey, who just said they're going to join the BRICS nations and wants to ditch the dollar for Russian energy, they are leading the way in 2022 on gold purchases. You have now 147 countries on the Belt Road, including all of the 13 OPEC countries. All of them are on the Belt Road Initiative. 6 of the 13 BRICS nations, 6 of the 13 OPEC countries have already joined BRICS or are in process of joining. The 7th, United Arab Emirates, just joined the BRICS Bank. And now you have Russia and China standing arm in arm on a stage a month ago saying they are announcing a new world reserve currency. At the same time, you have gold leaving the COMEX market at the fastest monthly rate ever. You have silver, on the other hand, being massively drawn down through the London Metals Exchange to the smallest amount ever in recorded, ever since they had started keeping track of the amount of silver on the LME, and you have over 100 million ounces of silver taken out of SLV by the authorized participants. So you see massive accumulation of gold and silver off the exchanges taking possession. So let's put all of this together, right? So what does it all mean when put together? And let's think about the Great Reset. How do you get a Great Reset? Well, first, you blow up asset prices to all-time highs. And then, at the lowest interest rates in human history, And then you incentivize the world to find a back door because you watch what just happened to the Russians, who 85% of the world is saying, well, you're still okay to trade with because they don't like the way the West has handled things. So they're all coalescing in this nation, 147 countries on the Belt Road. All of these countries in the BRICS nations, which amount to 90% of human population, all of this together. And think of the fallacy of composition. All of these countries, one by one, can't stand up to the U.S. You put them all together and they will dominate the U.S. So how does it all blow up? Why do you own gold and silver? Why? Remember, gold was classified the only tier one asset in the world next to U.S. dollars. Remember, the biggest money in the world, the central banks, the commercial banks, the sovereign wealth funds, the family offices, they're all buying it. They're all taking it off the exchanges, removing counterparty risk. You can see the drawdown from all of the major exchanges. How does this all blow up? Simple. Saudi Arabia joins the BRICS nations. Every OPEC producing country, all 13 of them are on the Belt Road. They all sit on a stage with their arms around each other on a Sunday night here in the States, Monday morning somewhere in China or in Russia or wherever this meeting is. And Saudi Arabia says, hey, US, thank you. It's been a hell of a ride. We appreciate it. As you know, we are being now protected by China and Russia. In fact, we struck a joint military cooperation agreement the day you pulled out of Afghanistan the way you did. And we realized that maybe you weren't the best partners to tie our wagon to. You know, you sent over President Biden to beg for oil. He didn't beg for oil. He hasn't even gone to Mexico or the Texas-Mexico border. He came and asked us to not join the BRICS nations. But we've decided after contemplation that, hey, you know what? It's in our best interest, and all of OPEC, who is on the Belt Road, that we're going to open up energy purchases in other currencies, including the yuan, the rupee, the ruble, maybe euro, gold, and dollars. Like that, it's over. Because what happens? Every country on the planet who has had to own dollars since 1974 dumps them. And if you ever saw the moving trading places where one Duke brother says to the other Duke brother, sell, Mortimer, sell, because everyone will start dumping dollars. As the dollar collapses, that's pillar number one. The dollar value collapses. What happens when those dollars collapse and hit the U.S. shores? Hyperinflation. What happens as an adverse reaction of hyperinflation? Interest rates spike. You have to have higher interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power. There's your villain. There is now, was it intended? Did they know this would happen? When everyone dumps dollars and Saudi Arabia and OPEC say, thanks for the memories, folks, and everyone dumps dollars and interest rates spike, stocks, bonds, real estate at the same time collapse along with the dollar. The four pillars of wealth in this country, stocks, bonds, dollars, and real estate, will all collapse as interest rates spike and as the dollar is globally dumped. And this is your great reset. This is how fragile the system truly is. And this is why you own precious metals. It is not to get rich, it's because we are on the cusp, I believe, of a change. Now, remember we talked about 75% of human population understanding on the Belt Road this new digital yuan. Well, what is the digital yuan? To me, it is a beta test. Just the other day, there was an article that came out by a man named Sergei Glazyev, and he is the Russian minister in charge of integration and macroeconomics for the Eurasian Economic Union. And he came out and he laid the fundamental principles by which the new U.S. post-dollar economic system will be based. And he goes on and says, and I quote, that it will not be based upon any particular currency as with the Bretton Woods order, but rather a market basket of local currencies tied more deeply to an array of real commodities such as gold, other precious metals, grain, hydrocarbons, sugar, etc. So think about the Chinese digital yuan. What better way to roll out a distributed ledger technology where you can show the world the veracity of everything that all of these countries have pegged? Why does the European Union not work? In theory, because there's nothing pegged to it, and each country is moving in different directions. But how about all of these countries coalescing not only against the maybe hatred's a strong word, but the universal dislike of the Western hegemony. So much so that we're seeing relationships being mended between Iraq and Iran, where they're building a railway between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're mending fences between countries who have hated each other for years. But you know the old statement, my enemy's enemy is my friend. They are all coalescing against a central theme. But that's not enough. We need to peg something. What are all the countries that own all the commodities? The BRICS. And all of the countries that are joining the BRICS own all the commodities. So what better way to roll out distributed ledger technology but to show the pegging of all of the commodities pledged to the new BRICS currency, which they just announced is coming out? Why is gold tier 1? You tell me. Did they know that this was going to happen? The inevitability and the mathematics of the dollar's demise? Is it going to be the central peg to a new world reserve currency? What better way to show the immutability and the veracity of this pegging, but on a distributed ledger, Chinese digital yuan, which I believe will be the rails to a new system, the rails to the new BRICS system, to the next BRICS currency. And when that happens, God help us in this country.
Not that we have the answers, but you'd be prepared to do something differently. Because you think there's 8 billion people on planet Earth. Probably the 200,000 listening to us today are more highly educated than 8 billion. I mean, we're in serious trouble. You know, years and years ago, I read a book by Buckminster Fuller, The Grunch of Giants. It's how our wealth is stolen via our money. So we have to learn about money, and you can do very well. But if you are ignorant, just hoping that, Biden and Kamala Harris will save you, I think you're in serious trouble.